Hey guys, Max here, and this is your daily update for yesterday, the 29th of January. It was, of course, a Saturday. Markets were closed, but we're going to cover a bunch of updates for the past week. We're going to look at the evolving situation in Ukraine in detail, along with what's going on in China as well. And then tomorrow, we're going to look at what's happening in Yemen with the UAE as well, and that situation and how it's evolving. And then finally, the Canadian truck protests as well, which are all conveniently being ignored by mainstream media. Now, for what was open, the crypto markets, we saw a relatively strong day, which has actually followed a relatively decent week. We've seen pretty consistent increases, a couple percent a day for a few days now, and Bitcoin is currently sitting just below $38,000. Ethereum is sitting at about $2,600, but some altcoins haven't seen those same gains. There doesn't really seem to be any very specific news that has caused this slight pump. Russia did come out and say that they plan to regulate cryptocurrency instead of just banning it outright, which is very slightly bullish, so that might have had a small impact. And Visa are looking to work crypto into their systems as well, which shows some element of mainstream corporate adoption. But again, this really isn't anything major, so the market moves is probably just a result of some increased sentiment and some more optimistic risk outlooks and things like that. Now, over in Ukraine, the situation has, of course, been developing, and it's been about a week since we spoke about it last, and it's been escalating as well, especially across Europe. Now, Russia and Ukraine have agreed to more talks in just over a week. Germany and France are in discussions as well. Biden gave a specific written response to Russia's demands a few days ago now, with Blinken claiming that it sets out a serious diplomatic path forward. Basically, Russia demanded assurances that Ukraine would never be allowed to join NATO. They wanted that door closed permanently, and they wanted it to be clear that Ukraine would remain inside Russia's sphere of influence. The problem is, of course, that the US doesn't rule over Ukraine, and they can't make decisions like that on behalf of Ukraine, so every demand was pretty much just ignored. The US basically suggested more transparency from the West regarding where troops are based and exercises and the like, basically in an attempt to show that the troops there are purely defensive. Now, Americans living in Ukraine have been urged to leave the country. Of course, just a few months ago now, we had that huge fiasco and that monumental failure as the US left Afghanistan in possibly the worst way they could have conceived. And so the US is a little bit conscious of another situation forming like that again, another photo of a Chinook over the American embassy, and they're trying to at least be a little bit prepared this time. Now, the UK is moving forward with the US on this. They seem to be moving in step with each other, as you might expect. The UK has already sent over a bunch of arms to Ukrainian forces, as have the US. Both countries are looking at sanctions that could be effective as well. One thing that is actually probably very scary for Putin is the idea that sanctions could target powerful Russians who store much of their wealth in the UK. For decades now, London especially has been a favourite place for Russian oligarchs to hide their wealth and keep it outside of the control of Putin and the Russian state. These same oligarchs are very powerful people in the country, in Russia. They have a lot of influence there. And if they are targeted, it could actually lead to major problems for Putin. The idea is basically that all of this hoarded wealth stored abroad in places like London could be frozen or seized, or these people themselves could actually be targeted. Now, while this is a possibility, it's always been a possibility. It was a possibility in 2014 and 2015 when Crimea was actually annexed in itself. But it never came to anything because it's a really major move and it would damage markets in the country. It would damage investor confidence in the country as well. So it's a very unlikely thing to see. But if it does come to fruition, then it would be pretty damaging for Putin. Now, a bit of a weird, provocative move from Russia, and one which really doesn't support the idea that Russia is just the poor, downtrodden-on nation just trying to protect their own interests, is the fact that Russia decided it was going to sail its navy off of the coast of Ireland in their waters, of all places, and go and fire its guns a lot and partake in some naval exercises. Now, Ireland, for people who don't know, is entirely neutral here, and they've made a very strong effort for about 100 years now to remain neutral ever since they gained their independence. Even during the Second World War, they maintained diplomatic relations with every country they could, including Nazi Germany, and actually sent a note of condolences to Nazi Germany when Hitler died. That's the extent to which they've tried to remain neutral. Now, Russia provoking Ireland like this is 100% a needless aggressive move, and one that Ireland has no ability to stop whatsoever. Again, for those of you who don't know, Ireland isn't a part of NATO. It has a defence force, but it's absolutely tiny, it's minuscule, very poorly equipped, manned and trained, and the Navy is also just absolutely tiny. It's basically just a small coast guard. Again, their air force is tiny, and the airspace of Ireland is actually policed by the British Armed Forces by agreement between the two states, because Ireland just doesn't have aircraft to police it. They don't have any jets or fighters or anything like that. Now, there is no way you can misinterpret this as anything other than Russia being aggressive to a neutral nation. It's that simple, and really it categorizes Russia as a whole and their foreign policy. Now, across Europe, unfortunately, the response has not been so consistent. Firstly, we have business interests, which are, of course, siding with wherever they think they can make the most money, as businesses so often do. Italy's biggest companies are meeting with Putin to expand economic ties to Russia. Governments were imploring these CEOs to not go and meet with Putin, but of course, they've just ignored them, as you'd expect. Now, this is a clear attempt to reduce the likelihood and effectiveness of sanctions against Russia. These CEOs will be promised opportunities to make huge amounts of money, and they will essentially become lobbyists for the Russian state, pushing their representatives and their government officials to allow Russia to just do as they please in Ukraine and just hope that no economic hits are had. This is, of course, cowardly from these companies. UniCredit, Pirelli, and Generali are the big three names here, but there's no surprise why this is happening, and we should be expecting this. They're public businesses, which means that they have two real aims: to generate lots of profit and to generate a high share price. Now, the luxury of private businesses like Stoic Media, which I own in its entirety, means that if I want to sacrifice profit for moral reasons, I can. The problem is when you have shareholders who have influence and voting rights, you can't quite do that. Now, Germany is the other part of Europe ensuring that there is no unified front here as well. The new Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, is already facing his first international crisis, and he just looks incredibly weak, to be honest. He has rejected sending weapons to Ukraine so that they might be able to defend themselves. He has even refused to allow allied countries to fly over Germany airspace in case that upsets the big bad Putin. Germany won't even allow Estonia to transfer Cold War era weapons over because they're morally bankrupt and they're only putting corporate interests first. Germany tried to stop the energy sector from being included in any sanctions on Russia, undermining the attempt by EU countries to actually do something for once. And of course now, Germany is adamant that Nord Stream 2 must go ahead, and they're trying to ensure that that isn't included in any potential sanctions either. It's literally only been a couple of months since she left, but I'm really starting to miss Merkel already. For once, the Green Party in Germany is taking a stand. They're the largest partner in a coalition with the SPD, the ruling party, and they are actually trying to push them in the right direction, but they're still vehemently anti-nuclear and the like, so I really never know what to think of that mess of a party. Now, I have been reading about this a lot. I've been thinking about it a lot as well. It's literally my job to just stay up to date on everything going on here, and unfortunately, for those who seem to think Russia is an innocent dove merely trying to ensure its survival, that just isn't the case. And Russia's foreign policy has been overly aggressive for far too long. It should be perfectly clear to everyone now. So many people seem to forget this, but a couple years ago, Putin literally tried to assassinate a Cold Era spy in the UK purely because he felt like doing it, and in doing so, he murdered a random innocent woman in the UK. I've called him a dictator as well, and the shills down below in the comments got offended at that because Russia has elections, they said. They of course conveniently forget the fact that the leader of the opposition of Russia, the only person who had any chance of actually being elected outside of Putin, was almost assassinated by Putin, again with the exact same nerve agent, the same poison that they used in Salisbury in the UK. On top of that, once Putin failed to murder this man, the only real opposition in Russia, remember, the only other person you can vote for, he had him imprisoned instead. That is not a democracy, it's a dictatorship, and it's a little bit ridiculous that I even have to explain that. Now, during this crisis, Russia has specifically threatened the Baltic states as well, for absolutely no reason. They are independent sovereign nations who, since leaving the USSR and embracing capitalism, have seen incredible successes, which is the complete opposite of what has happened in Russia. Now, if you're still sat down behind your keyboard defending a man who used to torture people in the KGB for a living, I have to ask why. Why do you insist on defending evil? Why do you insist on ignoring morality? Is it purely to oppose the US and the UK? Is it purely because you hate Biden so much that even Putin is a preferable alternative? Grow up, enter the real world, and oppose evil wherever it stands. Now, if we go over east to China, we see that they're still struggling with COVID, as we have been expecting. Now, Hong Kong has started to try and put into place restrictions to try and keep the city from being overwhelmed by the Omicron variant. Of course, the variant is still present in China. It's spread all over the world very quickly, especially when we consider the fact that we've only actually known about this variant for about 2 months now. Anyway, Hong Kong has a zero tolerance policy for COVID, just as the rest of the mainland on China does. And there are new concerns that this policy could keep Hong Kong closed down until 2024 and that it could fuel a mass exodus from the country. Now, apparently, the news on the ground from the Hong Kong authorities is that China is waiting for a powerful and hopefully an actually effective mRNA vaccine to be developed and distributed, which is of course going to take a while. Of course, if the CCP weren't so unashamedly nationalist, they could have just simply bought Western mRNA vaccines, as there are plenty to go around now. But no, the CCP is adamant that they must develop their own. Their original vaccine rollout wasn't particularly quick either. It started earlier, but just took a while to ramp up, in fairness, because the country is absolutely huge and there are 1.4 billion people, so the chances are this second time around is probably going to be quite slow as well. The fear for Hong Kong in particular is that this will force people, firms and foreigners in particular out of the city, and that would seriously damage Hong Kong's economic status around the world. The value of the city is in its diversity. If it slowly develops into just another Chinese city, if it continues to lose its independence, which seems very likely, foreign firms will simply just work from other cities in places like Singapore that are more international. Other countries are, of course, also making it easier than ever for young Hong Kongers to emigrate out, with the UK opening up British national overseas passports to millions of Hong Kongers, and on the high end, there could be as many as 400,000 coming to the UK alone. It's also worth noting that these fears are coming from the Hong Kong authorities themselves, as this is all coming from a leaked internal report into the impact of a COVID-0 policy on the city. Now, in mainland China, the CCP is planning to start a nationwide crackdown on money laundering that is supposed to last for 3 years, and it follows greater powers and actions against money laundering in the past. Now, you might not expect me to support money laundering, and I wouldn't blame you because it's usually a bad thing, but it is worth noting that in China, a significant portion of money laundering that goes on isn't about avoiding tax, and it isn't about committing fraud and stealing from a company or investors or anything like that. It's often just about keeping some money out of reach of the CCP. Now, it's not exactly news at this point, but very wealthy people in China go missing and even get murdered by the state all the time, and there is probably a huge amount of paranoia that comes with being wealthy in China, and lots of these people seek to get a portion of their wealth out of the country so that if something does go wrong, they do become a target of the CCP, they might be able to get out with some cash. This was also one of the main uses of cryptocurrency, especially cryptos like Monero, which are actually really secure. And that's one of the reasons the CCP has cracked down on crypto so much, because they don't want people to have the ability to move their money without the government's say. Controlling your citizens' assets is a brilliant way of controlling your citizens themselves, and China is of course all about control. Maybe China will also crack down on the fraudulent bookkeeping that is so common in the country. Maybe they'll crack down on companies that defraud investors, but to be honest, I think that's a little bit unlikely, as it's usually foreigners who get hurt by those practices anyway. Now, of course, China has not had a very strong economic performance recently. They've been struggling with COVID and trying to fight that off. They've seen this housing market decline, which is terrifying investors. Their tech crackdown has erased trillions of dollars of wealth as well, and consumer sentiment and spending in the country is starting to decrease also. Now, as far as how the economy is actually doing, exports are actually strong right now because the rest of the world is doing quite well. We've mostly recovered from the pandemic and there isn't a downturn yet, but the domestic economy is definitely struggling. Things like real estate sales are decreasing month over month very quickly, as are car sales as well, and small business sentiment is very poor too. Basically, the country's economy is being fueled by the supply crisis, which has increased costs of materials, but also profits for manufacturing firms, and there is no lack of international demand. The problem here is that should the US or other major countries enter real recessions, should the Fed's tightening change the economy and the environment of the world, China will then have nothing back to fall back on, and it will have a really bad time of it. The housing market in China is still very poor, though sentiment amongst investors is increasing as it looks like the CCP is getting closer and closer to actually helping the bankrupt companies out, and what essentially looks like soft nationalizations are probably going to be starting soon. Now, some of that Chinese state support is also being directed from within companies in the country. 15 mutual funds in China came out at the same time with statements basically saying that they are committed to buying their own equity-focused products in what is weirdly similar to Abenomics from Japan. Now, these firms are claiming that they're setting a good example for the market, but in reality, they're just buying their own products to inflate their values and push the markets up. This seems to be why Chinese stocks have been increasing by a fair bit recently, and it's possible that the aim is to try and convince other investors that the market rout is over, that stocks are bullish, so this might be trying to get others to invest back into the markets, and then this isn't just wasted investments. It's also very likely that this was coordinated by the CCP, 15 separate billion-dollar institutions all working together to push markets up is either a state-sponsored move or a cartel, and I have a bit of trouble believing that this could have been organized without the CCP's knowledge and support. I will still caution people against investing in Chinese stocks. This is pretty clearly market manipulation, and in the long run, I think it's very unlikely to actually make a difference in the investing environment in China. Now that is it for the day. We will be back tomorrow, of course. If you enjoyed this video, then leave a like and a comment to bless the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this, then check out our Patreon and join our community of investors. You get access to our Discord, loads of exclusive content like insight into my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. But I will just quickly say to wait to join until the 1st of February or you will be double charged by Patreon. I'm sorry, it's just a policy of theirs. They always charge on the 1st of the month and that's not something I can change. There's a link in the description to masterworks.io, a site that allows you to buy fractional shares of art from world famous artists like Banksy, which can be a great way to diversify your portfolio with non-market correlated assets. It's completely free to sign up, you don't have to buy anything, you don't have to hand over any card information, so if that sounds interesting, then make sure to check it out. There's also a link in the description to BLOCKFI, which will give you up to $250 in free Bitcoin when you use it. You can also get 9% interest on stablecoins like USDC, which is a far higher rate than you'll get from any savings account these days. Just make sure not to use Tether. Thank you all for the support. Thanks for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.